Hello everyone, and welcome to Mixed Methods. So we're going to be building on some of the things that we've already encountered during the module. So I think there are very mixed feelings about mixed methods out there. So I found these two very different opinions in the literature. So Creswell is kind of arguing that actually just to use any single approach in research may be falling short of kind of the really good practice that we see in sort of social sciences, whereas Yanchar and Williams, cited from Onwuebusi in 2012, felt that mixed researchers represent a group who failed to take seriously the assumptions and values that accompany the use of different methods, and that as such it should be avoided at all costs. So some very different perceptions out there about what mixed methods are and whether they should be used or not. So by the end of this session, and with the suggested reading, you should be able to describe and explain what the assumptions and the controversies are that underpin mixed methods research, the different approaches to and the different aims of different types of mixed methods research. You should have an idea of some of the key mixed methods research designs that are out there, and there are many. And you should also have an idea about what you need to do to assure quality in mixed methods research. So throughout this, I'm going to be weaving in my an example, which is my PhD research. So just to kind of give you a heads up that it is on a sensitive topic. So the title of my PhD research was The Role of Victim and Perpetrator Gender in Shaping Rape Myths and Their Impact on Support Services for Adult Survivors, Insights from a Socio-Ecological Approach. So the reason I'm going to be using this is that I've learnt an awful lot about mixed methods research by doing it through this PhD, and some of the kind of the learning that has helped me actually with understanding quantitative approaches more, qualitative approaches more in their own right, and when you're looking at integrating them in some way. But also some of the challenges that are associated with mixed methods, and really thinking about how can you make a piece of robust and defensible research. So what is mixed methods? Let's start off with a bit of an idea of what are the core features of mixed methods research then. So Creswell and Plano-Clark, this is from their 2011 edition of their book. There is a later edition, and I'd recommend this actually. It's Creswell and Plano-Clark book is very good. It takes you through a lot of the core issues in mixed methods research, and actually step by step sort of guides as to how to design your own research. But they argue that it's mixed methods research key features are that you collect and analyse qualitative and quantitative data, that you mix the two forms, and that's really important, and we'll talk a bit more about that in a little bit. That it will be framed within a particular, or a philosophical worldview. There are certain or particular types of theoretical lens that tend to be used, and again we'll see some of that later. And you'll approach your research question with a particular design piece of research. So and again, we're going to be looking at some of those research designs. So the thing that really sets it apart is around this idea of mixing. And to really get to grips with what mixing is, we have to first understand what it isn't. So we're going to have a quick look at this table from Creswell's book in 2004. And we looked at this in the quantitative refresher about what are the core assumptions that underpin quantitative approaches, and what are the core assumptions that underpin qualitative approaches. And you can see, or what we discussed then, was that actually there are quite different worldviews between quantitative and qualitative approaches. They differ in what they think the nature of reality is, so ontological assumptions. They differ in how they believe that researchers can go about knowing reality, so the epistemological assumptions. And they often also position values in a different way. So the axiological kind of assumptions underpinning the two approaches can be very different, as can the rhetorical assumptions, which is how you actually go about the language of research. How do you communicate research findings? And methodological, so the actual processes of research, the assumptions underpinning how you should do things, differ as well. In particular, quantitative approaches are very much about, to some degree at least, there is an external reality that's independent of the researcher or the participant's mind. So there is an objective reality that is singular. We tend to approach that then, if there is an objective reality, the idea is that we're going to move towards that truth with research. So we need to be as objective and unbiased in the way that we collect data and interpret data, measure it, and report it. So we'll take a value-free or unbiased approach to research. And we'll also communicate it in an impersonal style, usually, because that denotes that we are separate from the subject we're studying. And subject, I mean topic, not old school language for participants there. And also the process of research, there's an emphasis on looking at cause and effect and trying to isolate causal relationships between variables, taking a deductive approach where you have theory, testing a particular aspect of theory with data. And we're looking mainly to generalize findings from a sample that we've collected to a wider population, and we'll be using all sorts of mechanisms to do that. For example, things like representative sampling and so on. In contrast, then, qualitative approaches emphasize the idea that actually each person will interact with their environment in a different way, that their experiences are shaped by their own previous experiences and their interpretation of the world around them. So actually, the same event could be experienced in very different ways by different people. So there is an idea that actually there isn't a single objective reality, but there is more than one reality, or more than one experience of the world, and so there are subjective elements to that as well. So there's more of an understanding that also the researcher isn't independent from the subject, the topic they're looking at, that they're actually a part of the whole process, and that you have to embrace that and understand it. And part of that involves being clear that you will always approach something with a particular set of values, that you can't be unbiased, as it were, with the perception of post-positivist approaches in quantitative research. And so you'll use also typically more personal style, particularly in things like reflexive statements, to show that you are part of the research, that the findings have been generated at least in part by your interpretation, which has been shaped by your lens of experience and so on. In terms of methodological assumptions, then, there is a greater emphasis on inductive, of using data, looking at identifying patterns within data, and kind of building from data upwards. So it's all kind of, and it would depend, there's a continua, as always with these things, but that knowledge can't be understood or without context, that findings have to be understood in terms of the context in which they were generated. And it's not to say that you can't take findings from a qualitative study and apply them to a different setting, but the mechanisms by which you do that are different to quantitative. They're a different set of assumptions. So we can see, actually, if we're taking the really extremes of quantitative and qualitative, that actually they look pretty mutually exclusive, and we'll look at the impact of that for mixed methods in a moment. But the impact on research is that you start off with your worldview, your paradigm, which is shaped by your assumptions about epistemology and ontology and axiology. And that worldview shapes the kinds of theoretical frameworks that you might be drawing on, for example, kind of feminist approaches perhaps, which shapes your methodology, perhaps so your paradigm might be interpretivist, your theoretical framework could be feminist perhaps, your methodology therefore might be one that's aligned with kind of social constructionism, and the methods you use may be more about kind of gathering textual data, that sort of thing. So this was adopted from Crotty's work, but actually you can see that your worldview kind of shapes all of these things, and that's the sort of traditional approach that's taken. But actually I think what mixed methods research is arguing is that a topic can be looked at from multiple perspectives, in multiple ways, using multiple different frameworks and methodologies. And so that's what Cook refers to as kind of critical multiplism, and that we need to embrace that. So where does mixed methods fit then? So does it just kind of fit in the middle of that? Is it a bit of both? Is it kind of somewhere in between? Is it the moderate ground? And so you've got these two sort of core worldviews then: positivism, which is associated with quantitative approaches, and interpretivism, which is associated more with qualitative approaches. And they're running in opposite directions. And have you got mixed methods in between? What does that mean? And I'll just let you pause the video for a second and think, based on what we've just discussed, where do you think mixed methods fits there? Okay, I'm going to assume you've paused the video and now you've started it again. So we'll go on. But and it's important that we understand that mixed methods is not the same as multi-method. And you might be saying, well, why does it matter? But it does, because the kinds of conclusions that you might be aiming to draw from mixed versus multi-method research can be quite different. So the difference with mixed methods research is not that you've just done a bit of quantitative and you've done a bit of qualitative, which could be completely separate wholes in their own right, interpreted as such within kind of stages of a research design. But mixed methods is about integration, of bringing them together in some way, and there are different levels at which this can happen, and there are different ways that it can be done. But mixed methods is not simply, using multiple methods. And to reflect this kind of diversity in the way that things can be mixed, sometimes mixed methods research is called mixed methodologies because there is a particular emphasis on mixing worldviews themselves. It could be mixed models because of a particular approach, or mixed methods in terms of the techniques you're using to collect data. Or there seems to be a sort of growing preference for the idea of mixed research, using that, because that could encompass all of these things. So we're saying that in research there's been mixing, basically. And this is from sort of Johnson, Onwuebusi and Collins' work. So we can have mixing occurring at multiple levels, and that might be that one piece of research mixes something at the methodologist level, another at the methods level, but it may be that you look at mixing them at multiple levels within the same kind of program of research. And it's really a question that's kind of really important, and I think Creswell and Plano-Clark really talk about this, and some other authors as well in mixed methods that have produced mixed methods research guidelines. But it's really important to identify when mixing will occur, and to do that when you're designing your research from the outset. So is it going to occur at the end in terms of looking at the level of findings, and we'll look at that in a moment, or is it going to occur during the process of the research itself? And so research questions from a later phase of the study may be, in fact, influenced by the findings of an earlier stage of research. So you're mixing the findings with the research design and so on. So identifying when the research occurs is really, when the mixing in the research occurs is really important. And actually some authors use that to help identify what type of research design you've taken, for example. But what I think is really important to recognise as mixing is this idea of, particularly when you get to the level of findings, what is mixing? And it's, I think, the meta-inference. So Tedley and Tashikori, Onwebuzi and colleagues kind of argued that the thing that sets mixed methods research apart is the idea that you can develop insights through mixing quantitative and qualitative approaches that you wouldn't gain if you had the two in isolation. If you only took a qualitative approach or only a quantitative approach, or you took both approaches within a program of research but didn't try and draw them together in some way. And so Tedley and Tashikori, who are again giants in kind of the mixed methods literature, argue that there's this idea of a meta-inference that really is what's so valuable about mixed methods. And they argue that a meta-inference is the overall conclusion, explanation or understanding developed through an integration of the inferences obtained from the qualitative and quantitative strands of a mixed method study. And so you've got this idea that perhaps you've looked at quantitative approach, a qualitative approach, you have generated inferences in isolation from those two, and now you bring them together and explore how that builds a better understanding of the issue of interest. And if you look at the videos after this, I've uploaded a video by Tony Onwebuzi and another video by John Creswell. And in Creswell's video, he gives you some really good everyday kind of ideas of what mixed methods research looks like in terms of kind of Al Gore's documentary and the way that we use facts and figures with personal experience in the news, those sorts of things, but drawing them together. And so it's the meta-inference that sets apart mixed methods research. But Onwebuzi and Johnson argued that this idea of mixing, of meta-inference, we need to take it beyond just being seen as an outcome. So in terms of Tedley and Tashikori, they emphasize the meta-inference as the product, the end product, the end result of the research. But actually Onwebuzi and Johnson argued that mixing, this idea of the meta-inference, should be viewed as a process. It's the way that you engage with your research as the mixed methods researcher that generates also the outcome, but the process is really key. And actually what we need to do as well is to perform something called legitimation checks. So legitimation is where we work through this process of generating the meta-inferences, and we ensure that the inferences we generate from the mono methods, so quantitative and qualitative separately, they have to be really robust, and we can use the mono method techniques for assuring quality, and we'll look at those in a bit later. But then the actual process of mixing has to be robust as well, and we need to be thinking about what that means within the particular approach that we're taking. And as you'll see later in the presentation, it can get very challenging, but it's also an incredibly useful process. So the key thing is that there has long been what is being labelled the incompatibility thesis, or the commensurability debate. And so Johnson and Onwebuzi sort of talk about this, that there's an idea, and they kind of refer to the extreme positions of positivism and the extreme positions of interpretivism as the purists then. So these kind of researchers argue that quantitative and qualitative approaches are so fundamentally different. They are based on such fundamentally different worldviews that they cannot meaningfully be brought together, that you cannot understand them together. You have to pick one. You've got to pick either your quantitative approaches or your qualitative. They cannot be brought together, and if you try to bring them together, then it can be quite interesting in terms of what people think of you as a researcher. So in 2012, in a really influential paper, and there's a link to this later on, Onwuebuzi talks through, well, there are these really key myths about mixed methods research in the literature. The first myth is that he argues that there is still a perception that the paradigm wars still prevail, and that people use that language still to talk about these worldview wars. And he argues that actually that's misleading, that in sort of the 70s, 80s, there was quite a amount of tension then in the literature about mixing methodologies of mixing worldviews, but that has really begun to level out now. There is far more understanding and acceptance. So, for example, when you look at research tenders, if you're going for a piece of research, you're trying to get some money, quite often tenders will have on there that a request for both quantitative and qualitative data, because they can help you answer different types of question. And so actually, Onwuebuzi argues that this idea of the paradigm wars is sensationalist, that actually it doesn't influence as many people's experience of mixed methods research as some people make it out to be. And in fact, what you're doing is creating almost a straw man argument of this terrible conflict, when actually people have started to explore different ways of overcoming that. The second myth that he draws attention to is this idea of dichotomies, and that they're prevailing, and actually we need to get away from the really kind of clear-cut thinking of it's objective or it's subjective, it's positivist or it's interpretivist, it's quantitative or it's qualitative. That actually these kind of binary options don't reflect the variety of positions taken in research. So actually, what we should be thinking of all of these things is that they are on a continuum, and that you will have some approaches perhaps that are more associated with quantitative approaches, but that they can, under certain circumstances, be associated with qualitative approaches, and so on. And we have to try and avoid trying to pigeonhole certain approaches and perspectives into this kind of very much yes or no mentality. And the final myth, and I'd recommend reading this paper just to read this section, is around what Onwuebuzi argues are the purists' way of kind of shaming the mixed methods community. So some of the opinions that have been expressed in kind of well-known journals about mixed methods researchers is quite interesting, but also it doesn't represent a kind of collaborative, collegiate environment in research. So I think I showed you an example at the beginning of this about Janachar and Will Williams, and their criticisms of mixed methods researchers, and also people like Lincoln and Guber, who are huge in qualitative research, kind of argue that mixed methods researchers simply just don't understand the assumptions that underpin the different types of research. Therefore, they engage in mixed methods research because of their lack of understanding or skill in either quantitative or qualitative. So it's quite, can get quite heated. But also that they prioritise certain aspects of the research project that they shouldn't do. It's at the cost of good quality research, again, which you can obviously counter-argue. But he frames this as there's an idea that mixed methods as a paradigm, as an approach, a worldview, is a deficit kind of position. So he perceives that as there are arguments in the literature from quantitative purists and qualitative purists that mixed methods is always worse than a mono-method approach, when actually that's not the case, and it's all about kind of what you're seeking to research and find out, and that's what should drive the approach you take. So I'd recommend reading Onwebuzi's paper. It's a very interesting read. So to try and overcome some of these criticisms, researchers have taken different arguments then to justifying what mixed methods research is. So one of them, as I said earlier, is this idea of critical multiplism, that you can look at the same issue in multiple different ways, and you can find out something different using each and different approach. There's also an idea that there's an idea of kind of methodological weakness minimization. So quantitative research can be very good at identifying patterns of prediction, whereas actually qualitative helps you to understand more the experience and kind of provide a richness of experience and people's perceptions of their environments and so on. Sorry. What this isn't is triangulation, which is a different technique. So that's where you use the findings of one to see if you see the same findings in the other. So do my quantitative and qualitative things, are they saying the same thing? And that's not what mixed methods is. Mixed methods would be using these and joining together the meta-inferences, or the inferences from both, integrating them to develop a clearer picture. And again, John Creswell's video gives you a really nice example of that. But this is one argument that people have said. Actually, mixed methods means that we can get the best of both worlds. So that's why it makes sense to use. Another argument that, for example, McEvery and Richards use is that, hang on a minute, methodologies and methods are not woven together. They're not kind of bound together. We can't conflate methodologies with methods. They are separate ideas. And so they argue that actually we have to unpick the idea of these methodologies from the methods themselves and free them up. And actually, so we can do, for example, surveys have historically been frowned upon in the qualitative big Q, more extreme kind of on the interpretivist continua then. Surveys have been very much frowned upon by qualitative researchers. But actually people like Brown and Clark have explored how qualitative surveys can be very useful for gathering information on things like sensitive topics. So they look at things like body image, pubic hair habits, all sorts of weird and wonderful things that actually you probably would struggle to get someone to talk to you about face to face. So actually surveys, although they're typically associated with quantitative methodologies, actually they are also associated with qualitative methodologies. The same with observation, it can be associated with both paradigms. And again, interviews, so a structured interview is essentially a questionnaire that is administered by an interviewer. So we can see that there are kind of the methods, the techniques for data collection have to be unpicked from the overall approaches to research. And that's what these authors use to argue, to say actually we can mix methods that are typically associated with quantitative and qualitative methodologies without having to get into the whole kind of worldview debate. A different approach is to say, well, actually, quantitative approaches tend to be underpinned by positivism or post-positivism. Qualitative approaches perhaps are underpinned by interpretivism, and we've seen how they shape your idea about what reality is, the nature of reality and how we can know it, what your value system is and how that influences your research and so on. What some authors argue, and Onwebuzi and Johnson and authors like that, Creswell as well, talk about actually you kind of you draw on a different worldview, you draw on a different theoretical perspective. Or some authors call them paradigms. So, for example, you might draw on pragmatism, critical realism, or dialectic method or methodological pluralism. So these are three key theoretical perspectives that have their own kind of philosophical assumptions that say actually, to different degrees, there is both an objective and a subjective element of reality. And so we need to use both quantitative and qualitative methods to access both, to explore both. And so they kind of almost give you permission in a different way to draw together quantitative methodologies and qualitative methodologies or methods. And so if we look at, for example, pragmatism, as I said, it suggests that actually there is an objective reality that is external to an individual, but actually we might not ever be able to really truly get at that in a completely unbiased way. But there's also a really core part of experience which is generated through your interaction with your environment and through others, which is subjective, which means your experience of that objective reality could be very different from another person's. And so that's kind of one of the assumptions of this approach, pragmatism. In terms of knowing, how we can know reality, it suggests that things like reflexivity should play a key role in understanding your relationship to the research, the impact of the research on you, and so on, but that it can differ depending on what particular type of mixed methods approach you take. Broadly speaking, the axiological kind of position of pragmatism is one that's aligned with the transformative movement. So you're looking to use research to improve a social ill, something that an applied problem, for example, that we're trying to make better for individuals who experience or oppression or discrimination or so on. So broadly speaking, it tends to be associated with that kind of the role of value and bringing that into the research. The rhetorical position, pragmatism's argument is it depends. And methodological, the process of research, it argues that actually pluralistic approaches, so where you've got multiple approaches rather than just one set approach, is important. But pragmatism also can be used to argue that we should essentially stop faffing around the questions about ontology and epistemology and really start thinking about what works. So the argument that actually you put the research question first and you try and identify what approaches do I need to take to give me the best insight into this so I can do something about it. So again, it gives you a justification for mixed methods research that's quite different from some of the others. And the final kind of justification that I want to draw on is this idea of the radical middle. So this is again Onwuebuzi and Johnson, and they argue that the radical middle is just that actually it's about it's the benefit of juxtaposing quantitative approaches with qualitative approaches, of bringing together worldviews, of switching between emic and etic perspectives, which are kind of associated with quantitative and qualitative research in different ways. And so that generates new insights, and actually you could take qualitative data and quantize it, so you could turn it into quantitative data and see how that helps you understand the issue too. So the radical middle is that idea that actually we can bring all of this together, stop working in silos, and generate really strong, good quality meta-inferences through bringing and integrating quantitative and qualitative approaches. So this approach, this justification, is almost saying we're not going to try and find a way to get around the fact that we have different these approaches are associated with different worldviews. We want to bring them together to see what they tell us about the same topic. And so I find, again, there's a paper by Onwuebuzi where he talks about the radical middle, which is, there's a link to it in this presentation. So Onwuebuzi, again, you'll notice a theme in this. Onwuebuzi talks about what a mixed methods researcher looks like then. What are the qualities that you need? And he argues that we can use the moniker mixed. So you should be, M stands for a methodological thinker. You should be thinking carefully about the assumptions that underpin different approaches, what that can tell you about the research topic, the conclusions that you can draw from using those approaches, and so on. You should look to be integrative, so drawing together quantitative and qualitative approaches, integrated, which is where you're working within ideally a team of people with all sorts of different perspectives and skill sets, so that you can shed light on the same issue in different ways. And also what he refers to as integral, so you're actually looking at real world issues that are important and vital for us to understand. He also argues, so the X in mixed stands for xenophilus, so that's where you want to try new things. You want to embrace novel approaches and methods to explore how they can shed new light on a topic. And that's really important for a mixed methods researcher, because you need to develop skills in a range of different methods or approaches or perspectives. There's a key element of empowerment. So the E in the mixed model stands for empowerer, and that's where you use research to empower others, but also the research empowers you as the researcher. So this is that's kind of where we see that sort of transformative element coming through with your value system. And D stands for development. So again, you're developing the literature base, but you're also developing as a researcher, building on your skills, and you're recognizing that the boundaries of your competency and developing them. So that's what Onwubuzi feels are the kind of key features of a mixed methods researcher. Sorry. So as an example then, from everything we've just sort of talked about, if we think back to my PhD, and I'll talk through the design in a little bit, but my PhD used this idea of mixing at different levels. So actually I conducted a systematic review, and the findings of that influenced the development of the phrasing and the approach I took in a quantitative study which explored patterns of rape myth acceptance for victims of and perpetrators of different genders. And so rape myths are basically stereotypes that tend to shift blame onto a victim and away from a perpetrator of sexual violence. And so I used that then to inform, okay, these are the patterns I'm finding, these are the sorts of issues. Is that reflective of what people who support survivors, is it reflective of their experiences of supporting survivors? Are these the views that are encountered regularly, or are they views that are different, are the things that we're missing? And so I used those findings to inform the design of the qualitative phase of the research. So it was mixed at the research question and design level. But it was also mixed at the level of findings, and so I went through this process of generating inferences and meta-inferences, and I'm going to talk through that in a little bit more detail later. So in terms of research questions, well, can you just use the same sort of approach as you would with mono-method research or not? And actually I think this is only something that is fairly recently garnered attention in the sort of research methods literature, but you need to think carefully about how you approach research questions within mixed methods. There are different ways of doing it. So Creswell and Plano-Clark argue that actually what you could start off with is a quantitative research question, a qualitative research question, and then a mixed research question, which could be either focused on the content of your earlier research questions, or the methods, or a combination of both of them. And the idea is that you can show the kind of the staging of the research and the point at which mixing is really going to occur. Or you could have a single overarching but quite beefy research question that has components, a language that speaks to qualitative research, so exploring how or experience or something like that, and that also speaks to quantitative approaches, so things like impact, influence, do they affect this, that and the other, And so you could have one overarching research question and then separate that down in each individual study. So in my research, I did a little bit of both, really. So I had 2 overarching research questions. So my first was, in what ways do victim and perpetrator gender shape rape myths and rape myth acceptance? And my second was, how does gendered RMA impact on the challenges faced by support services for adult survivors? And what I did then was actually develop a specific research question for each part of each study in the research. But you can see that kind of actually both questions could lend themselves to taking a quantitative or a qualitative approach. And actually what I did was the first question was very much exploring how these idea of patterns and the ways in which gender shapes, so both at the level of patterns but also trying to understand the mechanisms that underpin gender's influence on rape myths. So I did that both quantitatively and qualitatively. And the second question was very much informed the qualitative phase of the research to understand, well, what are the challenges that adult services for adult survivors face? How does gendered RMA, rape myth acceptance, affect that, and so on. And this brings me on to my mixed research designs. So, as you've probably guessed already, there's lots of different ideas and approaches to mixed methods research. It's not a single umbrella term. There are lots of different ways of going about it. There are lots of different ways of talking about going about it as well. One of the key things is that you could have a fixed research design. So that is quite similar to a quantitative study where you have a research plan in advance of the data that you collect, and that's what you work to, and that's it. So you collect the data according to that plan, you analyse the data and so on. Or you may have an emergent research design, and this is where your design can evolve over time based on the findings of earlier phases of the research, based on kind of the development of or refining of research questions in light of something that you've identified, that you realise actually that's what I need to focus the remainder of the research on. So there's this idea of the emergent design as well. And so mine was emergent. There were some elements to it that I knew I was going to do, but others that were dependent on whatever I found in the first stages of the study. But in terms of actually, well, how do we classify different typologies? If you just look back at even the chapter in Creswell and Plano-Clark's book on typologies, you'll see that even their own typology has evolved hugely over the last decade or so. So this is very much an emerging area in the literature. But Creswell and Plano-Clark, for example, talk about the typologies. So this is where you've got this approach does this and this approach does that and so on. So you're kind of in types. And they had just selected out 15 different typologies that they'd identified in the literature. And that's not all of them at that point. This is just some of the key ones. There are other authors that they argue are about taking an interactive or systems-based approach, which is where you ask yourself as a researcher key questions and you allow the research design to come out of that kind of more systems-based approach. And then you have things like the synergistic approach, which again is kind of trying to merge some of the ideas of the interactive systems-based approaches with some of the typologies almost. So there's a whole range of different ways of doing this. But as I said earlier, the crucial element that a lot of these typologies, that a lot of these system-based approaches take, a crucial element is the point of interface. That's what Creswell and Plano-Clark refer to as the point of mixing. So the point at which you're going to mix the data, that's really what helps define your research design. And also, Creswell and Plano-Clark argue that if as you're starting out as a mixed methods researcher, you should start with a typology. There's a much clearer structure with a typology. Then as you gain experience and you develop as a researcher, then you should start branching out into the more dynamic, interactive and synergistic approaches, because there's less guidance on those and they're more experience based really. So they recommend starting out with a typology. And that's pretty much what I did. And I'll talk through that in a little bit. But Creswell and Plano-Clark's current typology is that you have explanatory sequential designs, exploratory sequential designs, and convergent designs. So it's very much their model was originally had something like 10 different types, so it's evolved a huge amount. For example, they've refined the model so that they've taken out the transformative design, because this is they've argued that actually this is more of a worldview that underpins social justice applications of mixed methods research. So they've taken out a whole type of research design that they had labelled as transformative. And multi-phase as well used to refer to some of the really complex designs that involved elements of explanatory and exploratory and convergent, potentially, research designs. They've argued that actually all mixed methods research in some way is multi-phase, so we should just drop that. It's not actually doing any benefit in helping us understand the more complex designs. So in a sequential design, as I said, you can have explanatory and exploratory, but an example of an explanatory design may be to start off with a quantitative phase, where you go out, you look at the patterns that are identified, you analyse that data. You, for example, you find that some types of rape myth are accepted to a much stronger degree for female victims in comparison to male victims, and so you want to understand, well, why is that the case? Then you move into a qualitative phase and you unpick people's perception of those myths with them. For example, why do they feel that they're associated more with female or male victims, or victims of other gender identities? And you analyse that qualitative phase, and then you draw together all of the findings into these meta-inferences to answer, at least to some extent, the research questions you set out to explore. So you can start here, a sequential explanatory design may start with quantitative, go to qualitative, and then draw the two together. In contrast, an exploratory design may be a qualitative phase. So quite often it may be if you want to design your own type of measure. So for example, if I wanted to design a questionnaire that measured rape myth acceptance in relation to victim gender, then I may go out and do interviews with people, relevant groups of individuals. Perhaps it might be laypersons, it might be experts in the field, it could be, it really depends on your approach, your research questions. And then you analyse that to identify the patterns. So what are the kind of stereotypes that really are associated with female victims, with male victims, with both, with neither, So, and then you may design a questionnaire and you could go out and then collect quantitative data to see if actually that's borne out. And so then you analyse the quantitative data, and then again you draw all of that together to generate meta-inferences from both phases of the research. So with an exploratory design, you may start with qualitative and move to quantitative. A concurrent or convergent design may be where you have the qualitative and the quantitative running simultaneously, and it could be that you're integrating and comparing the findings as you're collecting the data, and that's shaping future for data collection and analysis, or you draw together both findings in one go to kind of interpret them, or more usually you kind of generate inferences from both and then meta-inferences from everything together. But this, and as I said earlier, you can end up with a design that has sequential and convergent or concurrent elements to it. And if I take my example for my PhD research, that's what I had. So the first phase was systematic review. That influenced the design of the second phase. So there was a sequential element which influenced the design of the third and fourth stage of the research. But the third and the fourth stages were qualitative, and they were conducted simultaneously. So I had a concurrent element as well. And you can see here I've tried to outline, when I was writing this up, where the points of mixing occur, because quite often there are so many different approaches to mixed methods research design that actually you've got to be really specific when you're communicating your findings to others, and that's partly because this is a key aspect of ensuring quality of your meta-inferences. And so what Onwebuzzi and colleagues argue, and Tedley and Tashikori and so on argue, is that you should perform both monomethod legitimation checks, which is what you would typically associate with quality assurance of quantitative research, so things around reliability and validity, and qualitative research, which is around things like trustworthiness, so credibility, transferability, dependability, and confirmability. So those kinds of legitimation checks. And so you've got some robust inferences from the monomethod, and then you look to integrate those. But your process of integrating them has to be good quality as well. So Onwebuzzi has provided a framework for thinking about this, and what sorts of questions do you have to ask yourself as a researcher, and scrutinise your own work as you're doing this, so that you produce good quality meta-inferences. And so this is taken from their paper. I think it was Onwebuzzi, Johnson and Leach, I think, 2011. And so there's this idea of there are domains of methodological or research paradigms, kind of facets of those, that are points at which there could be threats to the validity of your meta-inferences. And so they argue that actually you have to think about these really clearly and address these, as some are going to be more relevant to your research design than others. So you have to talk openly about how the issues of paradigmatic mixing, the commensurability debate, how do you explain those? How do you justify your approach? Inquiry logics, it could be about kind of minimizing the weaknesses of either the quantitative or qualitative approaches. Conversion is where you've perhaps taken qualitative data and quantitized it. Are there any issues with that that could kind of mean that your conclusions are less robust? There could be things in terms of sample integration. That's with particular types of design where you may be trying to, in theory, sample from the same population. How do you make sure that that all makes sense, the approaches you take? This idea of multiple validities, so different realities and people's experience of them, how do you take that into account? And also your political commitments and things like that. So I'd recommend reading this paper. There's a link to it in the presentation that really takes you through it, but you'll probably need to read it a few times because there's quite a lot in there. But it is really helpful, and actually this is one of the best papers for looking at quality assurance frameworks for mixed methods research. So for example, in my PhD for the monomethods, what I did was I kind of talked about the checklists, the quality checklists that I've used to make sure that my reporting, my collection reporting of my each individual phase of the research was good quality. So I've used things like the guidelines that are produced by the Joanna Briggs Institute for looking at qualitative research, quantitative research, particularly quasi-experimental research, things like that, that are indicators of good quality work. And I use that to help me report my results to make sure that I was doing everything I needed to in terms of the interpretation and so on. But then I needed to think, once it got to the actual, the discussion chapter of the research, where I'm drawing together, integrating the inferences from all of my empirical work, I had to think about kind of reconciling my epistemological, ontological and axiological beliefs. So I was taking a pragmatist-informed feminist stance in the research, and I was conducting mixed methods research, so I had to try and reconcile the differences between those kind of the pragmatist and feminist worldviews and how they could come together, and how that meant that actually mixed methods research would make sense. So how did I reconcile the paradigmatic mixing issues? And so that was around kind of the threats from the philosophical assumptions and stances that I'd taken. And also thinking about the threats from the logics of inquiry. So at one point I was thinking about doing conversion of some of the qualitative to quantitative, but as part of what I was doing, I thought actually that might not be the best quality. I might not be able to draw very robust conclusions from that, so I didn't actually do that with the data. But what I found really key as part of this, and if you're a qualitative researcher, you no doubt you'll have already come across this. If you're a quantitative researcher more, then you may not have done. But what I found really key was this idea of reflexivity. And Walker et al. Argue that actually, particularly in mixed methods research, you need to be reflexive and think about the impact of quantitative research elements of your design as well as qualitative, and the meta-inference process. So I used prospective reflexivity and retrospective reflexivity. So prospective reflexivity is where you think about how your lens of experience, your values, influence the topic you've chosen to study, how you've gone about studying it, how you interpret the data you've collected, and so on. And retrospective reflexivity is thinking about how you've kind of learned from that process, how you've developed, how you've grown, how you would change things for the future. And I found those two actually really helpful, because like any research, it's really important to think about what you've taken from it personally as well. So some of the dilemmas I had to talk about as part of that, particularly around the kind of reconciling the philosophical stances and theoretical frameworks I was drawing on, I was informed by discussions about the fear in quantitative feminist research of looking at gender differences and reifying them, that because you've separated men and women out and looked at differences, you've said there are differences because that's what you've looked at, if that makes sense. So, should you ever look at differences between gender groups? So I kind of talked through what that involved. And also I was informed by another feminist author who took a critical realist stance in her research, but some very similar issues around the idea of, well, actually, feminist discourse really focuses on recognising everyone's voice as equally valid. But then if you're the researcher and you're putting your interpretation on it, and that's the interpretation that you're reporting, how do you reconcile that? Because in a sense you are inevitably prioritising your own voice as the researcher. And so I was thinking about how I kind of could get round some of those issues, or manage them, or reconcile them in some way. So what I'd like you to do, that's a very whistle-stop tour, but pause this video now and have a think about this activity. So think back to the quantitative refresher that we had, and where we used an example of taking into account people's personality. How do criminal victimization experiences impact on people's quality of life? So we were thinking about that from a quantitative perspective before, but have a think about it now from a mixed methods perspective. How might you break that down and look at it in terms of a mixed methods research question, or quantitative, qualitative and mixed methods research questions? What kinds of research designs do you think could be particularly useful? Just pause the video and have a little think about that now, and then we'll come back in a few minutes. Okay, so I'm going to assume that you've paused the video and you've started it up again, and I think this is where that idea of critical multiplism, that actually there are so many different ways you could go about looking at the same topic, and each approach would tell you something slightly different. I think this kind of area, this idea, personality, criminal victimization, quality of life, really shows how that's the case. And it may also have made you think about what the strengths and limitations are of mixed methods research. So in particular, mixing methods and methodologies, and I argue for the radical middle really. It can produce new theory, new methods, new approaches. It can help avoid people working in academic silos. So there's been an awful lot of research from a feminist constructionist perspective on kind of rape myths and rape myth acceptance, and not so much from a pragmatist perspective. So we can avoid working in particular silos and closing ourselves off to different ways of exploring the issues. And also it can be really valuable when you're looking at something as complex and critical and multifaceted as things like, for example, violence or sexual violence. It can help you take multiple perspectives on that, and it can help you develop a nuanced and multiply faceted understanding or insight into that issue. But also mixed methods research, because its heart, a lot of it is transformative. It can help you to identify ways of finding what works, and producing socially justice productive and impactful research. So it can be a mechanism for all of those things. Some of the limitations, or what I think of as more as things to consider, are your competency as a mixed methods researcher. And so if you watch the video that's on Blackboard, Onwe-Buzi talks about, Tony Onwe-Buzi talks about that as part of, well, if you're starting out as a mixed methods researcher, what sort of things do you have to think about? And that's one of the things that he says is important to recognise. Also, this field, mixed methods research, is evolving. The way that we describe it, the way we approach it is evolving. So when I started my research, the design descriptor that I used was something like an embedded multi-phase mixed methods explanatory design, something like that, really ridiculously long. And obviously by the time I came to submit my PhD, that was an obsolete descriptor. This idea of legitimation is a very important one, but actually it can be very nebulous and challenging. Everyone's research designs are so different. Trying to apply a framework to your research design can be quite confusing at times, trying to figure out, well, what does apply, what is relevant, what is not so relevant, or how do I make it relevant. These can be challenging issues, and that's something I found with my mixed methods PhD research. But it was a really valuable experience, learning how to think about it and apply it. But you also do have to think about the time and energy that it does involve and the resources it involves. And so for something like an MSc dissertation, you have to think very carefully about whether you could actually balance the demands of mixed methods research and do it justice. The risk is that you end up with a bit of a mishmash that burns you out, because it's you've tried to do so much in so little time. So I do think you have to think carefully about mixed methods research, but that's not to dissuade you if you're really kind of committed to it. So hopefully by the end of this session, you've had an idea about what the assumptions and the controversies of mixed methods research is, the different approaches to and the aims of mixed methods research, and kind of how people justify mixed methods approaches. Some of the key mixed methods research designs, and also strategies for assuring quality in mixed methods research, so how we can make sure what we're doing is good quality. These are some of the key papers that I've talked about. As you'll see, there's an awful lot of Onwe-Buzi there, but they are very worth. I find his and his colleagues' writing style is far more easy to get to grips with than some other authors out there. But I find these papers in particular really give you a good idea of the key issues around mixed methods. We also have a couple of books in the library. Now these are hard copies, but they are very worth looking at. And so in particular, designing and conducting mixed methods research. And so if you click on the hyperlinks in the slides, you'll see that it takes you to University Library page, so it kind of is bookmarked the books for you. But also Tasha Corey and Tedley's information in the Sage Handbook of Mixed Methods and Social and Behavioural Research. Again, they're one of the big go-to names, so if you're trying to justify an approach, you'll find more information on that approach in one of these, with one of these authors. So Onwuebusi or Johnson, Creswell, Plano-Clark, or Tasha Corey and Tedley. But hopefully that has been helpful, and if you do have any questions about anything in this presentation, please get in touch with me. So Laura Scurlock Evans. Thank you.